Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, I'm Jaison, Program Development Manager at Takshashila Institution. And in today's episode of All Things Policy, I'm very delighted to have Jaideep Vaidya, who writes on sports business for The Signal, a business and tech newsletter. Hi Jaideep, thanks for joining us today.
Hi Carl, thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and same here. Very much looking forward to having this conversation with you. So just to give you a brief background to what Jaideep does. So he primarily writes this newsletter for The Signal, which is a business and tech newsletter, as I pointed out. And prior to this, he was working for the Ken's Southeast Asia edition, if I'm not wrong, and also wrote another very, interesting newsletter on sports business called Moneyball. And, before joining the Ken, he used to freelance as a sports business writer for Forbes, India, Mint Lounge, ET Magazine, and Quartz. So he comes with a fair bit of experience in the sports business side of things. And I thought it was interesting for us to talk about a topic that has been gaining a lot of traction over the course of the last year or so, Jaideep, and that is to do with sports washing, right? And I'm sure as a journalist covering this topic, you would have come across varied sort of ideas and streams of thoughts, your own personal sort of opinion on this. So why don't we start off by maybe if you can just give us a sense of what does sports washing mean in this context, right? And we have the FIFA World Cup that's scheduled to happen a few weeks from now. So for those who are uninitiated, how would you describe sports washing as a practice?
So sports washing is basically the concept of, governments which have, say an abysmal human rights record using sports as, a sort of PR tool to legitimize their regimes and distract the public from all their human rights abuses. So this year, like 2022, has especially been a big year for sports washing because it started with the Winter Olympics in February, where, China's abysmal human rights record with respect to their ethnic minorities in the Xinjiang region was brought to notice. And the year will end with the FIFA World Cup happening in Qatar, another country whose human rights record has been in public gaze ever since, for over a decade now, ever since Qatar won the rights to host World Cup, which was back in 2010. And about, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, there was this report in The Guardian, which stated that some, thousands of migrant workers who were working in Qatar to, build these stadiums that will host the World Cup have died. So, sports washing, it's mainly Saudi Arabia has also been in the news, especially in the last year, ever since they purchased a majority stake in the Newcastle United Football Club. And they've also heavily invested in Formula One, golf, and now recently they've also started making inroads in cricket. So that's another example of sports washing. And you might be aware that Saudi Arabia has a very questionable record on human rights.
Yeah, no, thanks for setting the context to this conversation, Jaideep. And, as you had pointed out, using sports to essentially cover up, a pure human rights record and also to kind of gain that soft power and prestige among the international community is what drives a lot of these countries to sort of invest heavily in sports and sporting tournaments. So I wanted to start off by, just highlighting this paper by Alfred Archer et al. And it's called Sports Washing, Complicity and Corruption, Sports Ethics and Philosophy, a fairly long-winded title, but essentially the paper gives two arguments, right, on what is distinctively wrong about sports washing. And maybe the rest of the conversation can sort of revolve around these two arguments in essence. The first argument that this paper makes is that while sports washing brings a lot of monetary sort of benefits to the host country or let's say a sponsor, one of its distinctive disadvantages for the athletes, right? So the athletes who are associated with the event, you could even stretch that to say journalists who cover these events are also, kind of construed to be complicit in what the sports washer is doing. So it doesn't really rest alone with, or the blame doesn't rest alone with the nation state, but it also stretches to other stakeholders, right? And the
Yeah.
other is basically that, sports washing, when practiced in, let's say, an unfettered manner, what it does is it kind of tarnishes the whole heritage associated with sporting traditions, right? Which people hold very, sort of very closely and very deeply to them. So, what do you think is the reason, that sports washing has now gotten a very bad name? Because, I think it's fair to say that this has been done by nation states, over many, many years, right? And you can stretch this back to even centuries, depending on what frame of reference you want to use. So why do you think this has kind of taken a completely different meaning altogether in the current time?
Yeah, so like you rightly said, like sports washing is something that can be traced back to like the 1936 Olympics, well, infamously called like the Nazi Olympics, where, Nazi Germany tried to like sports wash its image in the world. So yeah, it's nearly, as a concept, it's like nearly 100 years old. But it's gaining prominence now because, the media, I think, in the last decade or so has been, heavily reporting on this, which is obviously a good thing. And in terms of like the main participants in the sport, like you mentioned, the athletes, I mean, obviously, you cannot expect the athletes to say boycott an event because like something like the Olympics or a FIFA World Cup is is something that happens once every 4 years, and for many athletes it's perhaps like their only time, the only opportunity in their career that they'll get to participate in such an event.
Mm.
So it would be unfair to expect athletes to boycott events in support, or rather to protest against sports
Mm.
washing. But I mean, there are ways by which athletes, if you talk of individual sports or like teams, when you talk of team sports, there are ways in which they can express their discontent. For example, the Denmark team, which is going to participate in the FIFA World Cup, so their sportswear, like their jersey manufacturer Hummel, has made a jersey where it has blocked out, all the logos and all the sponsor logos and everything, even of the Denmark Federation,
Mm.
which is basically their way of like protesting against Qatar's human rights record. And they've also said that not all, a percentage of the jersey sales, whatever they'll make from the tournament, will go to Amnesty International.
Mm.
So similarly, like the England team is going to wear like rainbow colored armband to, give basically in support of LGBTQ rights,
Mm.
which is again something that's, illegal in Qatar. Obviously, like, it has been, I mean, something like this has been criticized because the England team has not really said or done anything about the human rights issue. But certainly, like, there are ways, like, even Lewis Hamilton is someone who has, like, constantly voiced his personal opinion regardless of, what his sport, which is Formula One, makes him do. Like, for example, Saudi Arabia hosted their first Grand Prix last year,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think Lewis Hamilton had worn a helmet which had like the rainbow colors, again in support of LGBTQ rights. So, I mean, there are always ways in which like an athlete or teams can, protest against a certain regime or an organizer of a tournament with, without actually having to boycott it. And if I had to talk about like the media and journalists, again, like, you cannot expect the media to not, cover the World Cup or the Olympics. But I mean, what we can do is definitely be aware of what's going on and not, put our blinkers on with respect to
Mm.
the human rights abuses and whatever else the host country is accused of.
Mm.
So there's always a way to, bring these things into the spotlight and still, cover your sport.
Yeah. No, I find the argument that journalists covering, let's say the World Cup, for instance, would be complicit is fairly shocking to me, because I think the whole point is you don't sort of parrot the propaganda of the host country, but you want to
Yeah.
kind of bring out the ground realities of what's going on in Qatar. And that's why you need journalists there.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you that it's kind of taken a completely different meaning altogether. Another thing I wanted to bring in at this point is, how sports bodies, for all practical purposes have been treated as a very neutral platform, right? That you don't mix politics with sports. FIFA, especially has been quite cavalier in taking stances that, sort of downplay the, impact of politics over sports. So they, try to they basically sanction clubs or countries that essentially use, political symbols, for instance, right? And we saw this during the last World Cup, for instance. But I think this time around, with the whole Russia-Ukraine war playing out, what we see is an unprecedented stand by both FIFA and IOC to actually ban Russian and Belarusian players, right? So this is like kind of taking it one step further. So I think what we see in today's context is also how players are so much part of that national pride, right? And targeting individual players is now seen as, sanctioning that country per se, right? And that has its own sort of consequences. You spoke of boycotts, right? And how it's not practical to kind of expect athletes to boycott these sporting events. But I think one of the classic examples of where this has worked is, during the anti-apartheid movement, which essentially cornered South Africa, and, they received a lot of backlash for their sort of the atrocities committed to a section of its population. So there have been effective boycotts. But by and large, one of the reasons that boycott is probably not the right way to go about it is also maybe because there are a lot of livelihoods dependent on this, right? So at the end of the day, sports brings a lot of revenue to the country, of course, but at the same time, it's a source of livelihood for a lot of people. And I think that's where boycotts may not have the intended sort of consequences or the outcomes that you start out with.
Yeah, so this was again something that even some of the migrant workers in Qatar, said when they were interviewed by the media. I think I remember reading a story where the migrant workers were thankful that, they had got this opportunity to work over there and make, be a part of this World Cup. But I think the important thing is, to obviously that does not mean any their deaths or any injuries caused to them is brushed under the carpet. And also the more important thing is that the spotlight has been on Qatar's human rights record up to this World Cup, but what's going to happen after the World Cup is more important, because migrant issues and labor issues in West Asia has been a concern even before Qatar got the World Cup right. It was brought into prominence because of the World Cup, and it's important that once the World Cup is over, we don't lose track of what's going on in that region. So I think that's more important. Like, let's, that it's not forgotten once the World Cup is over and everyone moves on.
Yeah. No, absolutely agree with you on this. So, Jaideep, let's take a quick sort of commercial break and come back and talk about what are the implications for, those on the corporate side, right? The sponsors, and how they are impacted by being associated with what is a sports washing sort of event. So, we'll be back after the short break. Hi, we are back with the episode. I'm talking to Jaideep Vaidya on sports washing and how nation states use sports washing to kind of gloss over some of their human rights records. You earlier spoke about how Newcastle United, now majority stakeholder being the Saudi Investment Fund, which by extension is the Saudi Arabian state. So one of the fan groups, right, of Newcastle United, it's an LGBTQ plus community. They in fact want to adopt a very different approach as opposed to boycotts. And what they talk about is change through dialogue, right? So rather than burning bridges, they want to work very closely with the owners to improve the conditions of the LGBT community in Saudi Arabia. And I think this kind of speaks to the point you made just before the break about how we engage with this issue even after the event is over, right? And just how do we reconcile the fact that you have a nation state that's involved in these, say, ownership of clubs or sporting events, but how does this in fact translate to a change in society, for instance? And do you think taking this view of changing through dialogue is kind of just perpetuating this sort of problem, like maybe it's just kicking the can down the road when for a fact that there's probably not going to be any realistic change, right, that will take place. So how do we reconcile these two things?
Yeah, so I mean, with respect to Newcastle, obviously, like, I guess the Newcastle fans are, in a bit of a tight spot because
Yeah.
they can't really choose who owns their club. And, considering what, Newcastle has been through under its last ownership, you can probably like see why Newcastle fans are so happy that they've got a new ownership and, which has a lot of money and is investing in the club. But
Mm.
I guess like this United with Pride fans group that is, encouraging this, trying to start a dialogue to improve the conditions for the LGBTQ plus community in Saudi Arabia. It's
Mm.
important for not just them, but all Newcastle fans to be aware of what these issues are and not just again brush it under the carpet. So, I mean, I've seen some Newcastle fans, like this was just when like fresh into the new ownership sometime last season when some Newcastle fans had turned up for matches wearing Arabic clothes.
Mm.
So I mean that's going overboard, but there are definitely ways by which even fans can make their voices heard and encourage dialogue. Yeah, I mean it's obviously not, I mean I don't know if it's going to bring about some real change, but at least it shows that the fans are not turning a blind eye to whatever's going on.
Mm. Got it. So one of the other sort of schools of thought, if I can call it that, is similar to changing through dialogue, right? Or trying to bring about effecting change through dialogue is what Amnesty International is going to be engaged in. And that is, they want to take advantage of the international attention that Qatar is going to receive, right? From hosting this
Hmm.
World Cup, where basically, what is called in psychology as a Streisand effect, right? Which is
Hmm.
when there is an attempt to hide, remove, or censor information, it actually has the consequence of increasing awareness, increasing more awareness of that particular information, right? And that's why Amnesty International stance is, fairly useful to look at in this context. So we're looking at how Qatar is hosting the FIFA World Cup, which is a massive tournament involving many countries, many stakeholders, many people. There's also a very significant number of sponsors who are going to be a part of this tournament, and given that these sponsors are from, say, primarily Western countries, I don't have the data with me, but I'm making a fair sort of guess in this respect. So when these sponsors host, or when these sponsors are sort of spending money on hosting this tournament in Qatar, what could be the potential PR backlash for this? Because we live in a day and age where everything that a sponsor does just gets out on social media, and there are sort of public debates on this that also take place. News channels kind of chime in. So could you maybe shed light on what could be the potential PR backlashes for, let's say, corporates or sponsors when they sort of associate with what is essentially a sports washing event?
Yeah, so especially when it comes to events like the Olympics or the FIFA World Cup, they've got this primary partners who have, been with them for years and years. Like I think Coca-Cola has been, for example, associated with
Hmm.
FIFA for a very long time. And now with the whole controversy over Qatar, it's obviously any sponsor that's associated with such a tournament will also get caught up in that whole net. But I think if sponsors are in a bit of a tight spot because they have, multi-million dollar deals with the organizing bodies. But again, like what's important is that, you can still show that you are aware of these issues and at the same time you're not expecting a Coca-Cola to pull out of FIFA sponsorship ahead of Qatar 2022, but it can you know publish statements or really or press releases or get one of its top bosses to speak on these issues and say that we are pushing FIFA or the Qatar government into dialogue, because a lot of these brands also like support causes like, for example, Airbnb had, I think, donated to the Black Lives Matter movement, and Airbnb is another sponsor of FIFA. So on one side you are showing your support for one movement, but on the other side turning a blind eye towards human rights in Qatar. So it's a difficult position to be in as a sponsor. I guess what you can do is that, at least put it out that you're aware of what's going on and show that you are trying to engage the concerned authorities into a dialogue over these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we can just leave with one final thought here, Jaideep, and that's to do with how most of these narratives on sports washing seem to come from a very Western backed narrative, right? And that's clear to see in the countries that are targeted, right? So take Saudi Arabia, Russia, and some of the other, China, for instance, again, now at the receiving end of sort of the Western ire. So I think it's also important for us to not make this a global South problem, right? And I think it tends to become one, especially when these are Western backed narratives. So I think, that's also important to keep in mind, because you just need to stretch back a few hundred years to sort of pin the Western countries or nation states for the problems and atrocities that they caused, right?
Totally. Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, especially since a lot of the arguments against sports washing is from a Western sort of reference point. But yeah, thanks, Jaideep. It was great to have you today on the show. Do you mind telling your sort of Twitter bio where people can find you, your handle rather, and the newsletter that you write currently?
Yeah, so I write a weekly newsletter on the business of sports and gaming. It's called The Playbook. It comes out every Friday at 4 p.m. You can find a link to the newsletter on my Twitter handle, which is Jaideep Journo. That's JAIDEEP JOURNO, Jaideep Journo. So just you can find a link to the newsletter and you can sign up. It's absolutely free to read. And do let me know how you like it.
Thanks a lot, Jaideep. It was wonderful having you on the podcast. And I hope all those of you who've listened to it also had a few takeaways from this episode. And you can also weigh in, with your comments once the episode drops. Thanks a lot, Jaideep. Hope to speak to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. Thanks so much for having me again.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.